Tonight, as you settle back and let the weight of the day slowly slip from your shoulders, I'd like to invite you into a very different kind of night. Not the night you know now, with your familiar walls, your soft pillow, the quiet hum of distant traffic, or the gentle silence of your room. Another night. A night more than 80 years ago, under a darkened European sky. You are safe where you are. You are warm. You are in no danger, and everything we speak of now is long past. But in your imagination, if you'd like, you can drift back with me to a time when people were very tired, very afraid, and very determined to stay awake. Because this is a story about war, yes, but more quietly, more deeply, it is a story about human bodies pushed beyond their limits, about small white tablets rattling in cardboard tubes, and about the hidden cost of a kind of chemical courage. Let's begin slowly. Picture yourself in Berlin in the late 1930s. The city is still a place of tram bells, of bicycles clattering over cobblestones, of people in wool coats hurrying through chilly air that smells of coal smoke and damp stone. Neon lights buzz in a few crowded streets, and cafes spill out warm yellow light onto the pavements. You can almost hear the murmur of conversation, the clink of porcelain cups. Somewhere in this city, in the district of Moabit, workers file into a factory owned by a company called Temmler. Inside, behind brick walls and tall windows glazed with the dust of the city, a new kind of pill is being made. It is small, white, and unassuming, but the chemists are proud. They have refined an especially potent stimulant, derived from earlier amphetamine research. It lifts mood, sharpens attention, blunts hunger, and pushes sleep far, far away. They call it Pervitin. At first, it is marketed like an everyday modern miracle. The advertisements show attractive, smiling people, students with neat hair, busy mothers, office workers with stacks of papers, all apparently brimming with energy. It helps you get through, the message says in various forms, through long days at the typewriter, through night shifts, through exams. Imagine you, as a tired clerk or a medical student, standing at the counter of a Berlin pharmacy. The shop smells faintly of camphor and soap. Bottles line the shelves in orderly rows, labelled in black Gothic script. The pharmacist wraps a little box for you, perhaps with a reassuring word. This will help with your fatigue. He doesn't yet know, not fully, how strong this substance is, nor how it grips the brain, how the alertness it grants comes with a quiet tax on the body that will be paid later, with interest. For now, it is just another new thing in a world eager for efficiency. Outside, Germany is changing quickly. Flags hang from government buildings, new roads are being laid, radios crackle with speeches. The nation is rearming, factories run longer hours. There is talk of strength, of willpower, of pushing through weakness. In such a culture, a pill that promises more wakefulness fits very neatly indeed. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might imagine how Pervitin feels to someone who takes it for the first time. A heaviness lifts, their thoughts feel clearer, their limbs suddenly less leaden. The ordinary drag of the day is replaced by a strange, clean brightness. They feel perhaps not superhuman, but simply as if they can finally do all they are asked to do. That sense of, at last, I can keep up, is intoxicating in its own way. It is not long before people in uniform begin to pay attention. The German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, are preparing for a new kind of war. At least that is how their planners like to think of it. Not a repeat of the slow, muddy attrition of the First World War, where men rotted in trenches and battles were measured in yards gained at horrific cost, but a war of movement. Tanks, aircraft, mechanized infantry, coordinated with precision. A lightning war, a Blitzkrieg. In staff rooms heavy with cigarette smoke, officers and military doctors look at maps and timetables. To make such a war work, they know they must keep units moving day and night, pressing their advantage without pause. Fatigue, that quiet, implacable enemy, threatens every ambitious plan. Somewhere between those maps and the Temla factory, an idea takes shape. What if the ordinary limits of the human body could be nudged? By 1939, trials with Pervitin have already been carried out on military academy students and soldiers, observing how long they can stay awake, how their performance changes as sleep is pushed back, then pushed back again. The reports are striking. Where rested men might falter after a long march or a sleepless night, the men given Pervitin march on, eyes bright, movements efficient, sometimes even cheerful in their exhaustion. You can imagine the appeal of those reports to commanders facing the prospect of another vast European war. So, in quiet stages, Pervitin moves from the pharmacy counter into field medical kits. Orders are placed for millions of tablets. Before the war's great offensives in the West, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe will receive tens of millions of doses sent out across Germany in tidy cardboard packages and small cylindrical tubes. But for a moment, stay with the stillness before those campaigns, when it is not yet obvious what such chemical help will cost. The year is 1939. Imagine yourself now, not as a civilian in Berlin, but as a young soldier in a barrack somewhere in Germany. Perhaps you're in a small town where the streets are lined with tidy houses built of brick and plaster, their roofs steep to shed snow. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The barracks room where you sleep is long and narrow, with rows of metal beds, each neatly made with rough grey blankets. Boots stand in ordered pairs along the floor. You are tired. You have been drilling for weeks, marching, learning to strip and reassemble your rifle, practicing maneuvers in muddy fields. Your body aches pleasantly at night, but there is also a deeper fatigue, the anxious kind, born of not knowing what exactly lies ahead. One evening, the company doctor comes by. He is still in his tunic, the red piping of the medical service at his collar. He carries a small box of cardboard tubes and speaks to the assembled men in a measured, practical tone. There is to be a campaign, he says, soon. There will be times when you will be required to stay awake longer than is comfortable, perhaps much longer. For those situations, the army has provided a stimulant, a Wachhaltemittel, a stay-awake agent. He explains how it is to be used only on orders, only during operations, and that it is not a toy. His voice is matter-of-fact, reassuring. He talks of supporting performance, of overcoming natural tiredness at critical moments. Perhaps he even mentions that the same substance is used by pilots, by tank crews, a modern aid for a modern army. The cardboard tube rattles faintly as he passes one to your squad leader. You do not know the chemistry. You only know that your officers seem confident and you are afraid of failing in front of your comrades. Somewhere inside, a part of you may already be relieved that this little tablet exists. War begins in earnest with the invasion of Poland in September 1939. For many soldiers, it is their first experience of sustained operations. Trains carry them eastward. The smell of coal smoke fills the compartments, along with the cramped scent of wool uniforms and leather, of nervous sweat. When they disembark, they march and drive and dig and wait. The days begin to blur. In the letters some of them write home, those that survive for historians to read, there are mentions of long nights, of being on their feet for 30, 40 hours. There are also hints, small references to Pervitin or to those tablets, tucked among descriptions of mud and cold and fear. In your mind's eye, you might picture a column of trucks and troop carriers on a Polish road. It is late at night. The autumn sky is low and clouded, and the only light comes from masked headlights, slits of pale yellow bobbing through the darkness. The engines drone steadily. Men sway in the backs of the trucks, rifles between their knees, greatcoats pulled close against the chill. The natural rhythm of the body says, "Sleep now." But the column cannot stop. An officer moves along the line of vehicles, speaking to the non-commissioned officers, passing on the order. A tablet is pressed into each man's hand. Some swallow it with a sip from their canteen, grimacing at the bitter taste. Others tuck it under their tongue, waiting for it to take effect. For a while, nothing much changes. Then the weariness recedes, as if someone has turned down the volume on their fatigue. Their hearts beat a little faster. Fog seems to lift from their thoughts. Jokes resume, though a little more loudly now. Someone begins to sing a marching song under his breath, tapping his fingers against the metal side of the truck. The column drives on through the night. From a military standpoint, the effect is exactly what the planners wanted. Units can advance for longer, seize crossings before an enemy has time to organize, exploit breakthroughs, coordinated with armored spearheads and close air support. Such endurance looks like tactical genius. From inside the individual body, though, this cleverness feels different. You can imagine how, after 30 or 40 hours awake, even with a stimulant buzzing in their veins, men's perceptions begin to warp. Their hands may still load rifles quickly, their legs still carry them forward at a march, but the world can take on a strange sharpness, edges too crisp, colors ever so slightly wrong. A misplaced confidence creeps in, the feeling that one can do anything, that caution is unnecessary. For now, in this first campaign, the experience is new, and many soldiers simply feel relief. Relief at getting through, at not feeling the crushing weight of sleep in their limbs when orders demand that they push on. Months later, in the spring of 1940, these lessons are taken and expanded for the Great Offensive in the West. The assault through the Low Countries and France that will shock much of the world. Here, Pervitin is woven into the plan itself. Shortly before the offensive begins, what historians will later call a stimulant directive goes out to army doctors. It emphasizes that in certain situations, success has depended on overcoming fatigue, and that stimulants are to be used systematically to enable forces to operate without sleep for extended periods. Shipments go out, millions upon millions of tablets, to be stocked in field hospitals, in unit medical kits, in the pockets of medics who will follow the advancing troops. You might imagine the scene in a field dressing station, just behind the front lines on the eve of the offensive. It is evening, and the light is fading to a smoky blue. Tents have been erected, their canvas walls stained from previous rains. Inside, a doctor and his staff open crates stamped with military markings. They unpack bandages, ampules, scissors. Among these medical necessities are small boxes labeled with the now familiar name, Pervitin. Each box is neat, almost cheerful in its design. The typography is modern, clean. It looks, in a way, oddly harmless, almost like a confectionery brand or a new type of chewing gum. A nurse, perhaps a young woman conscripted into service, her hair pinned neatly under a cap, lifts one of the tubes and shakes it lightly, listening to the soft clatter inside. She knows roughly what it does. She has seen pilots on it, their eyes unnaturally bright before long reconnaissance missions. She cannot yet see the long road ahead for some of the men who will take these tablets, the dependence that will creep up on them, the exhausted crashes after operations, the trembling hands and racing hearts, the sleep that, when it finally comes, is thin and haunted. She only knows that the army wants soldiers awake, and that this is what the army has provided. It is worth pausing here, dear listener, to remember that none of these people, not the factory workers, not the pharmacists, not the doctors and nurses, not the young men in their field grey uniforms, can see the full picture as we can now, looking back across decades. From your vantage point, tucked safely in bed, you can see both ends of the story at once. You know that Pervitin is a form of methamphetamine, a substance now widely recognized as dangerous and addictive, notorious in peacetime for the damage it does to bodies and lives. They did not have that knowledge. Some warnings existed, of course. Medical journals had begun to note adverse effects, nervousness, heart palpitations, sleeplessness that became torment rather than relief. But in the atmosphere of rearmament and impending war, those cautions were easily swept aside by the promise of more energy, more alertness, more output. You might think of it as a kind of collective tunnel vision inspired by fear and ambition. In the offensive that begins in May 1940, German armored columns and motorized infantry plunge westward with astonishing speed. Much has been written about the operational planning, the daring thrust through the Ardennes, the psychological impact of air raids and rapid mechanized assaults. But beneath those grand narratives lies a quieter, more intimate story than the maps reveal. The story of millions of individual nervous systems pushed to their limits. Imagine you are with a panzer crew in those first days of the attack. The tank is cramped, metal surfaces cold to the touch, even when the engine is running hot. The air inside smells of oil, sweat, and hot metal. You wear headphones that press against your ears. Your world is the crackling voice of the commander, the jolt of the tracks over uneven ground, the metallic clank of the turret traversing. You have been awake for many hours already when the order comes to drive through the night, to keep pushing without pause. The commander reaches into a small pouch and produces tablets. He passes them around with the matter-of-factness of someone sharing cigarettes. You swallow yours. Again, the world sharpens. The worry that your eyelids will droop vanishes. You feel wired, alive, almost exhilarated. The tank seems easier to control. Your reactions feel crisp. When you spot movement at the edge of the road, a figure darting into the trees, a flash of muzzle, your response is instantaneous. From the outside, to a staff officer reading reports, it might look as if the unit has simply performed exceptionally well under pressure. Their tanks advanced farther than expected. Their crews fought off counterattacks despite lack of sleep. From the inside, there is a price. Not yet fully paid, but accruing. Sometime around the second night without proper rest, your body begins sending signals that something is wrong. Your heart no longer just beats, it hammers. Your mouth is dry no matter how much water you drink from your canteen. Your thoughts seem to race, leaping from one idea to the next. You feel alert, but also oddly detached, as if watching events from just outside your own skull. And still, the orders come. Drive on. In another part of the front, on a dusty road lined with poplars, a column of infantry advances on foot. These men, too, have been given tablets from their company medic. You might join them in imagination, your boots thudding the packed earth, your rifle heavy across your shoulders. Night falls, but the march does not stop. The men sing for a while, then fall into silence, each wrapped in his own cocoon of thoughts and drug-bright wakefulness. Hours stretch. Here and there, one of them begins to mutter under his breath, to talk to someone who is not there. Another jumps at every shadow. The medic notices, perhaps, but there is little he can do beyond noting it in his report. The offensive must not lose momentum. It is important to say that not every soldier who took Pervitin suffered dramatic psychological effects. For many, it was simply a bitter pill they swallowed a few times, an unpleasant but forgettable aid like strong coffee or cold water splashed on the face. Yet for others, especially those given large doses over repeated operations, the edges of reality frayed. They experienced hallucinations, paranoia, deep crashes of depression, and exhaustion when the drug left their system. Some became dependent, asking persistently for more tablets, or seeking them out through unofficial channels when official supplies were cut back in later years as the side effects became harder to ignore. In your quiet room, perhaps with the soft light of a bedside lamp beside you, it may be difficult to fully grasp the desperation that can drive such dependence. But you might think of times in your own life when you were pushed very hard, working through the night, caring for a newborn, sitting by a hospital bed, and remember how everything else began to narrow down to the simple need to keep going. Now add the fear of war to that, the fear of making a mistake that might cost a comrade his life, the terror of being caught asleep on watch, the pressure of orders issued with clipped urgency. In that space, a pill that promises you will not fail, you will not fall asleep, carries a powerful pull. From a distance, some commentators have called Pervitin a kind of chemical cheating, a way of bending the rules of human endurance to gain tactical advantage. There is truth in that. The Wehrmacht was, as far as we know, the first army in history to integrate a powerful synthetic stimulant so formally into its operational planning. But cheating, in its everyday sense, often implies a simple moral judgment. Someone chose an easier road instead of working harder. Here, the reality is more complex, more tragic. Because when an army reaches for a chemical to keep its soldiers awake, it is not only the enemy that will pay. The soldiers themselves, the very ones whose performance the drug is meant to enhance, become battlegrounds in a quieter war. One fought in neurotransmitters and overtaxed organs, in frazzled nerves and fraying minds. As you lie here listening, safe and warm, you might feel a kind of double vision. On one side, there is the sleek image the regime liked to present. Columns of tanks rolling forward with unstoppable energy, pilots fearless in the skies, infantrymen relentless in their marches. The word Blitzkrieg itself suggests something almost natural, like a storm, as if the lightning of German arms simply flashed across the map. On the other side, there are the small white tablets, the trembling hands, the exhausted bodies that could not escape the basic truth that humans are not machines. For every hour stolen from the body's need for rest, some kind of reckoning would come later. If you listen closely, beyond the roar of engines and the bark of commands, you might hear another sound in this story. The quiet rattle of pills in a cardboard tube, an almost domestic, everyday sound. It is strangely intimate, almost homely, set against the vast brutality of war. That contrast between the ordinary and the terrible, the individual and the massive machinery of conflict, is where much of our story will live. For now, allow yourself to drift back from the roads of 1940, from the cramped tank interiors and the dusty marches. Return for a moment to that Berlin pharmacy, to the early days before chemical warfare on one's own soldiers, as some historians have described it, fully unfolded. You stand at the counter. The glass jars on the shelves catch the light. The pharmacist, in his white coat, wraps up your purchase with practiced hands. Outside, trams rattle past. Children run along the pavement. Life, on the surface, looks almost ordinary. How many of the people who passed through such shops knew that this same product would soon be packed into the kit of almost every German soldier heading to the front? How many of them understood that a war would be fought not just with bullets and shells, but also with altered brain chemistry? War has always strained the human body. In every era, soldiers have used substances, wine, rum, coffee, tobacco, to cope with fatigue and fear. In that sense, Pervitin is part of a long lineage of stimulants used in conflict. What makes this particular story different is the industrial scale, the synthetic power of the drug, and the way it was woven, almost seamlessly, into the doctrine of a modern army. As we go on, we'll walk more slowly through that world, through barracks and aid stations, through staff offices where decisions were made, through the lonely, wired hours of sentries pacing their posts with too much wakefulness and not enough rest. But for now, dear listener, let your breathing deepen a little. You are not in a barracks, or a tank, or on a road through the Ardennes. You are in your own space, in your own time, with a bed that waits patiently for you whenever you choose to close your eyes. The past can be heavy, but approached gently, it can also offer something like perspective, even a kind of gratitude. The next time you feel tired at the end of a long day, you might remember those men who were not allowed to be tired, whose natural exhaustion was overridden by a chemical command to keep going. And you, unlike them, have the luxury of listening to your body, of honoring its need for rest. So, we will continue this journey together, moving further into that tense, stimulant, bright world of wartime Germany. but always with the understanding that you can drift away into sleep whenever you need to, leaving the story to wait for you, patient and still, like a closed book on the bedside table. And as that imaginary book waits, if you'd like to open it again, we can turn another page together now. Picture yourself once more in the muted grey-green world of the German army in the early years of the war. It is very early morning, that hour when night is thinning, but sunrise has not yet truly taken hold. Mist hangs close to the ground, a thin veil over fields and hedgerows. Somewhere near the front, in a cluster of tents and makeshift wooden huts, there is a field medical post, the forward edge of the army's attempt to patch its own human machinery. Inside one of these huts, a military doctor sits at a plain table. The lamp beside him throws a warm circle of light over papers, metal instruments, and a half-empty enamel mug of coffee gone cold. His tunic is unbuttoned at the throat. His hair is flattened in odd directions from hours of work. On the table, among his reports and casualty lists, lies a small open box of Pervitin. He did not become a doctor to do this, to count out stimulants into little envelopes, to decide which company gets how many pills. He trained to heal, to diagnose infections, to stitch flesh. Yet here, under military discipline, he finds that part of his role has become something more ambiguous, managing performance, not just treating disease. If you sit beside him in imagination, you can look over his shoulder at the paper he is working on. It is a form where he must note the distribution of medical supplies, bandages, painkillers, antiseptics, and stimulants. There is a column for Wachhaltemittel, stay-awake agents, and he writes neat numbers there. 100 tablets to one company, 200 to another, based on their orders and the operations planned for the next days. He knows, from his training and his reading of medical bulletins, that Pervitin is powerful, that it can cause nervous agitation, tremors, even collapse when overused. He may have seen soldiers come into his care after long, stimulant-fueled operations, men whose hands shook when they tried to hold a cup, whose thoughts seemed disordered, whose eyes darted around the room as if watching invisible threats. Sometimes they speak too quickly, their words tumbling over each other. Sometimes they sit in a kind of stunned quiet, as if the world had suddenly gone dim. He writes their symptoms in his report. He may even underline a phrase, add a cautious note to his superiors. Adverse reactions observed following repeated doses. But then he looks at the operational orders pinned above his desk. There will be another push tomorrow, another forced march, another night where units cannot be allowed to rest if the plan is to succeed. The choice he feels he has is not drugs or no drugs, but drugs or exhausted men collapsing at critical moments. So he continues counting tablets. In war, many people find themselves in positions where every option has a cost. The comforting clarity of right and wrong blurs into shades of grey and a spectrum of harms. For the military medical corps, Pervitin sat precisely in that murky zone. They could see its dangers, but they could also see its usefulness. Imagine now that you follow one small paper envelope from his table to the field. The envelope is tucked into a medic's bag. The medic is a young man, perhaps only a few years older than the soldiers he tends. His bag is heavy with bandages and dressings, morphine syringes, antiseptic solution, scissors, a tourniquet, and the little packet of tablets. He moves with his company as they advance, staying close, but not too close to the front line, always ready to hurry forward when someone calls for sanitator. Medic. The cry comes with a particular tone, half command, half plea. As the day's fighting stretches into night, the medic watches the men flag. Their steps drag, faces grow slack with fatigue. Orders come down the chain. The unit is to push on, through the night, to seize a bridge before dawn. The medic hears the company commander speak to the platoon leaders. The words Pervitin and dosage drift through the chill air. When the tablets are distributed, the medic stands nearby. Some soldiers accept them wordlessly, swallowing them like any other medicine. Others make awkward jokes, covering their unease. A few hesitate, then shrug and take the pill anyway, not wanting to be the only one who refuses. The medic knows these men. He knows who has a pregnant wife at home, who is saving every bit of pay for his parents, who is brave, who is quietly terrified. He wonders for a moment if he should say something, warn them more sharply, insist they use the drug sparingly. But rank and discipline stand between him and such moral gestures. So he checks his bag instead, making sure he has enough bandages, enough morphine. He anticipates the aftermath. The men who will stumble or fall, not just from enemy fire, but from their own overstretched bodies. You might feel, in this moment, a sense of how narrow the space for individual choice can become in such hierarchies. The soldiers, the medics, even the doctors are all enmeshed in a larger system of orders, expectations, and fears about failure. We like to think, in peacetime, that we would be strong enough to refuse harmful choices. But war compresses time and amplifies pressure. When everything must be decided in moments, when disobedience can mean court-martial or death, and when the person telling you to take the pill is the same person you rely on to lead you out of danger, the path of least resistance often wins. Now shift your attention from the infantry on the ground to the air above them. High in the sky, where the air is thin and frigid, a German bomber crew sits in the cramped fuselage of their aircraft. The engines are a constant roar. The plane vibrates with mechanical life. The crew are strapped into their positions, oxygen masks at the ready, eyes fixed on instruments and targets far below. For pilots and aircrew, fatigue is not just unpleasant, it is deadly. A momentary lapse of attention can send a plane into the ground or cause a misjudged turn that exposes them to anti-aircraft fire. Long bombing raids and reconnaissance flights often stretch late into the night, and then into another day. Before such missions, flight surgeons hand out Pervitin as part of the pre-flight routine, along with briefings, equipment checks, and final words from commanders. You can imagine a pilot sitting in a ready room, his leather flying jacket creaking as he shifts in his chair. A doctor, perhaps with a clipboard in hand, moves down the row, checking each man's blood pressure, asking about any recent illnesses, and then issuing a tablet or two with instructions that by now sound familiar. When you feel yourself getting tired, take this. It will help you stay sharp. The pilot rolls the tablet between his fingers. He has flown before without it, knows the bone-deep tiredness that can creep up during a mission, especially on the return leg when the adrenaline of the attack has faded. He also knows that in the chaos of air combat, there may be no second chances. So he takes the pill, and later, thousands of meters above the earth, as he guides his aircraft through clouds and flak, he feels its effects, a heightened clarity, a sense of speed, of being at the center of a sharpened world. It's easy, from a distance, to see the appeal for the Luftwaffe. More alert pilots, fewer mishaps due to fatigue, a more efficient use of expensive aircraft and trained crew. But for the men themselves, the story doesn't end when the plane lands. After hours of artificial alertness, when they return to base, their bodies do not simply flip a switch back to rest. Many find that they cannot sleep, even when given the chance. They lie in their bunks, eyes open, hearts still racing, thoughts circling. Some pace, moving restlessly between the barracks and the latrines, smoking one cigarette after another. And when sleep finally comes, it can be jagged and thin, full of nightmares and sudden awakenings. The next day, or the next night, may bring another mission. It is here that the cycle of dependence can quietly begin. A pilot or crewman remembers how he felt on the last mission with Pervitin. The confidence, the crisp focus, the sense of being able to react quickly. He also remembers how dull and sluggish his thoughts feel now after poor sleep. The idea of flying without that chemical support becomes unnerving. So when the doctor comes by with the tablets again, he does not hesitate. He may even, as time goes on, ask for them more frequently, or take them preemptively, not just when exhausted, but whenever he wants to feel more in control. In your own life, you might recognize faint echoes of this pattern, even if the stakes are far lower. Perhaps you have reached for a stronger coffee than usual before an important meeting, or relied repeatedly on energy drinks during a stressful period. These substances, too, offer short-term benefits that can quietly weave themselves into habit. The difference with Pervitin is magnitude. Where caffeine gently nudges the nervous system, methamphetamine grabs hold firmly, flooding it with signals of wakefulness and reward. The brain responds by adjusting, and then, when the drug is absent, it can feel as if an essential part of one's mental machinery is missing. Now imagine, within this same war, another figure in a very different setting. A clerk in a rear echelon office, perhaps in occupied France, or in a German city far from the front. He is not in physical danger. His days are spent at a desk, typing reports, sorting files, handling logistics, all the paperwork that keeps an army running. His superiors demand speed and accuracy. The workload is relentless. The hours stretch, and he takes work home in his briefcase, laboring into the night under a bare electric bulb while his family sleeps. In this more bureaucratic world, too, Pervitin finds its place. Some offices receive supplies as part of a general issue, the drug considered useful for night shifts during bombing raids or for particularly urgent tasks. Others obtain it through informal networks. Someone knows a pharmacist or a doctor sympathetic to their needs, and soon there is a little jar or box in a desk drawer. Our clerk discovers what many students and office workers in pre-war Germany had already learned, that Pervitin can make a pile of documents seem less daunting and the long hours at the typewriter pass more quickly. It gives him the ability to work late, to finish his assignments, to please his superior. But in the morning, after a short, restless sleep, he feels wretched, drained, edgy, his hands unsteady on the keys. His mind drifts. Small mistakes creep into his work. So, telling himself it will only be once more, he takes another tablet. You can see how its reach expands. From frontline troops to aircrew, from medical staff to clerks, from the battlefield to the office sifting through the battlefield's paperwork. At every level, the logic is similar. The war demands more than the body naturally wants to give. The stimulant offers a way to extract that more. There are, however, moments when the cost shows itself so starkly that even the most hardened officials cannot ignore it. Consider, for instance, the reports that land on the desks of senior medical officers about soldiers who have suffered severe breakdowns after extended Pervitin use. One such case, reconstructed by historians from surviving documents, describes a soldier who, after days of continuous operations with the help of the drug, begins to behave strangely. He hears voices where there are none, sees enemies in every shadow. He accuses his comrades of plotting against him, refuses orders, becomes violent. Eventually, he must be restrained and removed from his unit, not because of enemy fire, but because his own mind has turned against him. The doctors examining him list possible causes: shock, sleep deprivation, stress, and the heavy use of stimulants. They treat him as best they can, with rest and sedatives, perhaps with a stay in a military hospital away from the front. For some men, time and sleep bring improvement. For others, the damage seems to linger, a permanent crack in the once solid glass of their thoughts. Such cases alarm the medical authorities. Some begin to argue for stricter control over the distribution of Pervitin, for limits on dosage and duration of use. Circulars are issued, reminding units that stimulants are to be used only in exceptional circumstances, not as a routine crutch. But the war does not slow to accommodate these guidelines. As the conflict grinds on, with new fronts opening and old ones stretching thin, commanders in the field continue to face the same immediate pressures. They still want, they still feel they need, men who can march and fight through exhaustion. And so, in practice, the use of Pervitin remains widespread, even if official policy begins to grow more cautious. From your comfortable vantage point, you might feel a certain frustration at this. Why did they not simply stop once the harms became clear. Perhaps you've seen something similar in modern life, a technology or practice that brings obvious benefits but also troubling side effects, and yet is difficult to abandon because so much else has been built around it. Our tools shape our expectations, and our expectations in turn shape our dependence on the tools. In wartime Germany, Pervitin became one of those tools. It dovetailed neatly with a culture that prized relentless effort, that celebrated the overcoming of weakness, that framed rest as a kind of indulgence rather than a necessity. The drug did not create that culture, but it amplified it, giving it a chemical edge. To see this more clearly, imagine a small scene far from the front, in a civilian home during the height of the Blitzkrieg victories. In a modest apartment, perhaps in Munich or Hamburg, a young woman sits at a kitchen table. The stove radiates a gentle heat. A pot of thin soup simmers. A child sleeps in the next room. On the table in front of her are sewing supplies and a stack of work, uniforms to be mended, patches to be sewn on, tasks she has taken on to earn a little extra money and to contribute to the war effort. She is tired. She has worked during the day in a factory or an office, queued for rationed food, cared for her family. Now, late at night, she must keep sewing if she is to meet her quota. On the table, beside the needle and thread, lies a small familiar box. Pervitin, purchased over the counter or acquired through a friend. For her too, the drug offers a way to stretch the day, to dig into reserves of energy she does not truly have. She may take it once, just this week, she tells herself. Then again the next. In a society where giving one's all is praised, where posters and radio broadcasts constantly urge citizens to greater sacrifice and effort, the quiet moral barrier to using such a stimulant can erode quickly. This is how a wartime drug intended to sharpen soldiers' performance seeps into the broader fabric of society. But at the heart of our story remains the soldier on campaign, the human being in uniform whose body becomes an arena for both heroic effort and chemical experiment. Let us go back to him now. It is late 1941, and the war has expanded eastward into the vastness of the Soviet Union. The landscapes are different here. Endless forests, wide rivers, roads that dissolve into mud with the rains and into frozen ruts with the snows. You can picture a group of German soldiers huddled in shallow trenches or makeshift dugouts on the Eastern Front. The cold is intense, a deep, penetrating chill that seeps into bones. Their uniforms, designed for earlier campaigns in milder weather, are inadequate. Their boots grow stiff with frost. Fatigue here is not just from marches and combat, but from the continuous assault of cold, hunger, and fear. Sleep, when it comes, is often brief and fitful, interrupted by artillery, by patrols, by the need to maintain constant readiness. In this environment, the temptation to rely on Pervitin can become even stronger. Yet the cost is higher too. Men already weakened by malnutrition and exposure are more vulnerable to the strain it places on the heart and the nervous system. The line between useful stimulation and dangerous overdrive grows even thinner. You might imagine one such soldier, perhaps leaning against the frozen wall of a trench in the small hours of the night, his breath a pale cloud in the air. His eyelids droop, his head nods. A comrade nudges him, reminding him that he is on watch. He knows that falling asleep on duty can have severe consequences, not just in terms of punishment, but because the lives of his comrades depend on his alertness. In his pocket, he feels the reassuring shape of a small box. He hesitates only a moment, then takes out a tablet and swallows it, washing it down with a sip of icy water. Within half an hour, the bleak, heavy fog of exhaustion lifts. The stars seem sharper, the sounds of the night, distant artillery, rustling branches, become more distinct. He paces, his movements quick and purposeful. Relief floods him. He will not fail his watch tonight. But tomorrow, when the drug has worn off and his body's sleep deficit has grown even larger, he will feel a weight heavier than before. If his officers then demand more marches, more digging, more combat, he may reach for the drug again. Thus, the spiral continues. As you lie here in your warm bed, you might feel the contrast keenly. Your tiredness, if you feel any, has no such desperate context. You can choose rest. You can close your eyes, knowing that your world will not collapse if you do not force yourself to stay awake another hour. That, perhaps, is one of the quiet lessons hidden in this dark chapter of history, that the ability to honor fatigue, to see it not as an enemy, but as a signal to be heeded, is a kind of privilege. In the coming parts of this journey, we will sink further into the personal stories, the long-term consequences, and the way this chemical cheating echoes through post-war lives and memory. We will meet men who could not shake the drug's hold even when the war ended, and others who spoke of it only in hushed tones, if at all. But for now, let your attention gently widen again, away from the frozen trenches and the rattling trucks, back to the quiet of your own room. The world of Pervitin and Blitzkrieg is far away, safely sealed behind the glass of time. You can look at it, examine it, feel for the people trapped within it, and then set it down when you need to. The soldiers of that era did not have that luxury. They had to live inside it, pill by pill, night by sleepless night. As your breathing slows, you might take a moment to notice the simple kindness of your own tiredness. That soft voice in the body that says, "You have done enough for today." Where they were told to silence that voice with a tablet, you are allowed to listen to it. And whenever you are ready, we can walk a little further along that shadowed road together, always at a pace that lets you drift away into rest whenever sleep comes to claim you. So let us move a little closer, as if we were kneeling quietly at the edge of that frozen trench, watching one particular life unfold among the many. Imagine a young man called Friedrich. You don't know his last name. You don't need to. He stands in for so many others. He grew up in a small town in central Germany, where winters were cold, but not like this. Not like the hard, unyielding cold of the Eastern Front. At home, snow meant soft white roofs and the hiss of a coal stove, mugs of hot soup, the smell of wet wool as coats steamed dry in a cramped hallway. Here, snow means everything is sharp and thin. The sky is metallic. The air scrapes the inside of his nose when he breathes. His boots, which once felt sturdy, now sometimes freeze to the ground if he stands still too long. Friedrich has been at the front for months. The early optimism has burned away in the long grind of marches, waiting, sudden bursts of fighting, and the steady erosion of sleep. In his pocket, wrapped in a bit of brown paper, are a few Pervitin tablets. At first, he took them only when ordered, along with everyone else, before a night march or a push to take some small village whose name he will forget. Each time, he felt the same sequence, the first stirrings of alertness, the sense of power returning to his limbs, the way the blurred edges of his thoughts snapped into focus. But over time, he began to notice something else. On nights when he took Pervitin, the world did not just seem sharper, it also seemed less heavy. The damp, creeping dread that often lay in the pit of his stomach receded. The little annoyances of soldier's life, a comrade's snoring, the scratch of lice, the endless mud, bothered him less. He felt buoyed up, carried along. On nights without it, everything felt heavy again. His own thoughts grew thick and slow. Worries crowded in. Will I ever see home again? What is happening to my parents, my sister? How long can this go on? He did not think of himself as someone who relied on drugs. He would have scoffed at the idea if you'd said it to his face. He was just doing what everyone else did, using what the army provided to get through impossible days. But if you could watch him from above, as you lie there in your own quiet room, you would see a subtle shift as the weeks become months. On a night when he is not ordered to take the tablets, when he is simply cold and tired, and on the verge of another long watch, he fingers the brown paper parcel in his pocket. No one has mentioned Pervitin. His sergeant has not lined them up with cups of water. There is no specific instruction. He stands there, listening to the wind ripple over the snow, watching the dim shapes of trees in the distance. His eyelids feel unbearably heavy. His thoughts drift toward home and then snag on ugly images he cannot quite banish. He imagines an enemy patrol slipping through the darkness while he dozes, imagines the shout, the gunfire, the chaos. He unwraps the paper. Just this once, he tells himself. The bitter taste hits his tongue. After a while, the familiar climb. Heart faster, mind clearer, cold air suddenly invigorating rather than punishing. From the outside, nothing has changed. He is still a silhouette against a pale horizon, a soldier pacing back and forth with a rifle on his shoulder. But inside, a small line has been crossed. The line between, I take this because they tell me to, and I take this because I feel I need it. He is not alone in that crossing. Back in Germany, months earlier, his wife has stood in a pharmacy under the warm glow of electric lights, listening to a pharmacist with kindly eyes. He has recommended a new product, a kind of pick-me-up, useful for housewives with too much to do and for loved ones at the front who need extra strength. The packaging is almost cheerful, neat, modern typography, promises of restored energy. There are even chocolates laced with the drug, marketed as little treats that lift the mood and help you get through long days. The names are catchy and reassuring, a blend of modernity and comfort. She buys a box. At home, in a kitchen that smells of cabbage and starch and the faint dust of coal, she packs a parcel for Friedrich. A scarf she has knitted, some cigarettes, a small cake, if she can spare the ingredients, and the box of tablets, nestled as another gesture of care among the knitted wool and paper-wrapped food. She writes a note in her careful handwriting. These are supposed to help when you are tired. Use them when you need them. She underlines that last phrase, feeling both protective and proud. She is doing her part, she tells herself. She is sending him strength. When he opens the parcel weeks later in a mess hut that smells of stew and damp uniforms, the tablets feel not like a cold military supply, but like love, solidified and pressed into pill form. He smiles when he reads her note. He may tease his comrades with it. Look, my wife wants to keep me awake even out here. But underneath the joking, another connection is forged. Between the drug and the warm thought of home. Between chemical alertness and emotional comfort. You can see, can't you, how hard it would be for someone in his position to view this little white tablet as an enemy. From our vantage point, with what we now know about methamphetamine, we might want to shout back through time. Be careful, this will tax your heart, fray your nerves. It will make sleep, that gentle healer, harder to reach. It may not let go of you easily. But history is like a river. We can watch it flow, but we cannot talk upstream. Instead, we can only follow it. As the war drags on, reports begin to collect in the in-trays of senior medical officers and bureaucrats in Berlin. They are written in stiff official language, but between the lines, you can sense a growing unease. There are mentions of nervous disturbances following prolonged use, of states of agitation, of men who, after repeated Pervitin doses, exhibit what today we would call psychotic symptoms, hearing voices, seeing things, becoming violently suspicious. There are also more prosaic complaints, heart palpitations, chills, excessive sweating, severe insomnia, crushing fatigue once the drug wears off. Some doctors, especially those who see these cases up close, begin to push back. They write careful memoranda warning of the dangers of routine stimulant use. They recommend stricter controls, lower doses, longer breaks between administrations. A few go further, arguing that dependence is forming, that soldiers are requesting the tablets repeatedly, that their performance suffers in the long run. In response, regulations are tightened. Pervitin is officially reclassified, no longer to be sold so freely over the counter to the general public. Within the military, guidelines are revised to emphasize that it should be reserved for emergency situations, not used as a daily aid. On paper, it looks like progress. In practice, the front is far away, and paper does not always travel faster than need. Out in the frozen forests and muddy fields, Officers still face the same unrelenting math. Distances to be covered, hours until dawn, attacks to be launched, defenses to be held. When the choice feels like drugs or failure, the tablets emerge again, little white coins in the palms of tired men. You might think here of how, even in modern organizations, official policy and lived practice can diverge. A security protocol exists, but the deadline is tight, so someone props a door open just this once. A company discourages overtime, yet quietly rewards those who answer emails late into the night. The letter of the rule and the lived reality drift apart. In wartime Germany, Pervitin lived in that gap. It became both sanctioned and semi-clandestine, both officially controlled and informally traded. Some soldiers received it through proper channels, from medics and doctors. Others obtained it on the side, from comrades, from sympathetic pharmacists, from parcels sent from home. And as with any substance that alters mind and body, it did not affect everyone in the same way. Some men could take it a handful of times and then stop, their bodies and brains shaking off its influence once the immediate need passed. They might remember it, later in life, as just another unpleasant part of the war, alongside the lice and the bad food and the fear. Others were not so fortunate. Picture Friedrich again, months later. His unit has been through a grueling series of engagements. They have advanced, retreated, dug in, been shelled, moved on. The names of villages blur together. The seasons shift, but the strain remains. He has fallen into a pattern now. Before a difficult night, he takes a tablet. On days after such nights, when the exhaustion is almost unbearable and his mood sinks into a leaden despondency, he reaches for another, just to feel normal again. His comrades might notice small changes. He is more irritable, snapping over small things that once would have rolled off his back. He talks more quickly at times. His words, tumbling out in a stream, then falls into stretches of brooding silence. His hands sometimes tremble, not just from cold, but from an inner vibration. On watch, he is hyper-alert, flinching at every sound, seeing movement where there is none. Once, he almost fires on a shadow that turns out to be a tree branch swaying in the wind. After a particularly intense operation, where the unit is ordered to hold a position for over 48 hours with almost no rest, taking repeated doses to keep going, he crashes hard. When they are finally rotated back from the front line to a rear position where they can theoretically rest, Friedrich finds that he cannot truly sleep. He lies on a crude bunk in a hut that smells of wood smoke and damp straw. His body is exhausted, muscles aching, eyelids heavy, but his mind whirs, replaying scenes of the last days, spinning out anxious fantasies of what might come next. The more he cannot sleep, the more he worries about not being ready when they are sent forward again. The worry itself keeps him awake. His heart hammers as if he were sprinting, though he lies still in the dark. Eventually, in desperation, he turns to the only thing he knows that seems to change his state: another tablet. Of course, this makes sleep even harder to reach later, and so the cycle deepens. If you have ever experienced insomnia, that cruel paradox of being desperately tired yet unable to drift off, you might feel a pang of sympathy here. Imagine that experience stretched across weeks and months under the constant threat of violence, with only a blunt and dangerous tool available to manipulate your consciousness. In this way, the war carves deep grooves into Friedrich's nervous system. He survives, perhaps. Many did. Let's imagine that he does. The war eventually ends. The world shifts. Uniforms are hung up, sometimes not so ceremonially, in closets or trunks. The Eastern Front collapses back toward Germany. Cities are bombed. Borders are redrawn. New authorities take over. Old flags are taken down. Friedrich is discharged or captured and later released, or simply walks home along broken roads with a pack on his back, like so many others. Now picture him standing at the door of his family home. The street looks smaller than he remembered. The paint on the front door is peeling. The windows are taped against bomb blast or newly repaired. His heart races as he raises his hand to knock. Inside, his wife hears the sound and freezes, then runs to the door. There is joy, relief, tears. They hold each other, both thinner than before, both carrying invisible weights. A neighbor peeks out through a curtain, then smiles when she sees who has returned. Word spreads. He is back, one of the lucky ones. On that first night, he sleeps like the dead. His body, finally free from the demands of the front, claims the rest it has been denied. His wife watches him breathe, noticing how he sometimes twitches, as if startled in his dreams, but also feeling the simple, enormous gratitude of having him there, warm and alive. But the patterns the war carved do not vanish in a single night. In the weeks that follow, Friedrich finds himself restless. Civilian life feels strangely muffled. The tasks before him, finding work, fixing the roof, chopping wood, standing in queues for food in a shattered economy, are exhausting in a different way. There are no clear orders, no schedule imposed by bugle calls, no immediate life or death decisions. And then there is the fatigue. Sometimes it comes like a wave, overwhelming him in the middle of the day. At other times he lies awake at night, mind looping through memories. He startles at sudden noises, his heart leaping in his chest before he can remind himself, I am home. The war is over. He misses, in an odd and guilty way, the artificial clarity Pervitin once brought him. Back then, a tablet could cut through foggy thoughts and bring a brittle confidence. Now, there is no official supply. The cardboard tubes are gone from medic bags. The parcels no longer arrive with boxes of cheery, drug-laced chocolates. But in the half-ruined city nearby, black markets flourish. People trade whatever they have. Cigarettes, food, stolen goods, medicines. Among the things passed from hand to hand in dim stairwells and cellar corners are stimulants, leftover military stocks, diverted shipments, pills scraped together from who knows where. If Friedrich feels the pull strongly enough, he might find his way to such a source. Or he might hear from a former comrade that, someone I know can still get the old stuff. Some veterans did exactly that, carrying their wartime chemical companions into the fragile peace. Others did not. They gritted their teeth and endured the long, slow unwinding of their nervous systems on their own, sometimes with the help of alcohol, sometimes with the numbing effect of hard physical labor. In any case, the war's experiment with chemically stretched endurance did not simply end when the guns fell silent. It continued quietly in the bodies and minds of those who had been subjects of that experiment. From where you lie, perhaps with a duvet drawn up around you and the gentle glow of a screen or lamp nearby, you might feel a kind of aching tenderness for these people of the past. They were not superheroes, not villains in a movie, but human beings faced with choices that were not really choices, their nervous systems conscripted into a war alongside their limbs and their muscles. When historians refer to Pervitin use as chemical cheating, they are often thinking at the level of strategy and tactics, an army that used chemistry to gain an edge over its enemies. It is a useful phrase. It captures the idea of a shortcut, of bending the natural rules of human endurance. But in the quiet bedrooms and kitchens of post-war Germany, cheating would not have been the word in anyone's mind. Instead, there would have been questions like, why can't I sleep? Why is my husband so jumpy? Why does my heart race when there is no danger? Why do I feel so empty without the drug that once made everything brighter? In some cases, doctors tried to help. Post-war medical records where they survive show diagnoses like nervous exhaustion, war neurosis, and other terms of the time that covered a range of symptoms we might today recognize as post-traumatic stress, depression, or substance use disorder. Treatments were limited. There were sedatives, milder stimulants, rest cures. There were also, sadly, a lack of understanding and patience in many quarters. Europe had many wounded to care for, both physically and mentally, and resources were scarce. Against this backdrop, the long-term consequences of wartime Pervitin use became just one thread in a tangle of suffering. If you were to meet an elderly Friedrich decades later, sitting on a bench in the weak autumn sun of a rebuilt city, you might find it hard to see all this in his face. He might look like any other retired craftsman, his hands rough from a lifetime of work, his eyes crinkled at the corners. He might mention the war only briefly, if at all, but in certain moments, on sleepless nights perhaps, or when the sky flashes with lightning that reminds him of artillery, the old patterns may still stir. He might lie awake, heart racing, remembering how easily a little tablet once altered his state. He might feel grateful that those days are gone, and also strangely haunted by how much of himself he had given up, how much of his natural rhythm was commandeered in those years. And you, listening now, can hold both images at once, the young man pacing the trench under artificial alertness, and the old man in his cardigan, walking slowly to the bakery in a peaceful city. The drug he took was extraordinary, but his pain was ordinary, human, familiar across time. War has always demanded that people override their body's signals, march farther, stay awake longer, endure hunger, endure cold. In the past, this overriding was accomplished by sheer force of will, by discipline, by the crude help of alcohol or coffee. In the Second World War, with Pervitin, that ancient pattern acquired a new, synthetic intensity. You might feel a faint echo of it in our own age, though in far gentler forms. The way modern life sometimes whispers that rest is a luxury, that we should be always reachable, always productive, always on. Energy drinks, strong coffee, glowing screens late into the night. These are mild companions compared to wartime stimulants, but they live in the same family of ideas. So perhaps, as you lie here, you can treat your own tiredness with a little extra kindness, recognizing it as something precious rather than something to be fought. The men who took Pervitin did not have that option. They were taught to see fatigue as an enemy to be, crushed chemically, not as a messenger carrying a simple plea. Enough, for now. We will, in time, move our gaze to the larger pattern, to the way other countries, too, turned to stimulants, to how post-war societies slowly came to terms with what these substances had done. We will visit labs and offices, read over the shoulders of post-war researchers as they try to understand, in clinical language, what it meant to spend years in a chemically sharpened state. But for this moment, let the image soften. See Friedrich at his kitchen table years later, the war long over. It is evening. The window is slightly ajar, letting in the sounds of a peaceful street, a bicycle rattling past, a dog barking in the distance, the faint hum of conversation from a neighbor's open window. On the table is a simple supper: bread, cheese, a few slices of sausage, perhaps a glass of beer. His hands are steadier now than they were in those first uneasy months after he came home. The lines on his face have deepened. His wife moves around the small kitchen with the easy choreography of habit. He feels tired, ordinary tired, the kind that comes from a day's work, from age, from living. Once, years ago, that sensation would have triggered, almost automatically, the memory of a cardboard tube in his pocket, the idea that relief came from swallowing something bitter and white. Now he stands up, turns out the lamp, and goes to bed. He lies down. His bones ache pleasantly against the mattress. He listens to his wife breathing beside him. Outside, the city is quiet. Eventually, without chemical assistance or obstruction, he drifts into sleep. You too have that gift, right now. No one is going to shake your shoulder and press a tablet into your hand, telling you that you must stay awake for another march, another watch, another raid. The only orders here come from your own body, and it is, at this moment, gently suggesting rest. We can continue to wander through this history together, tracing how a small white pill became entangled with big ideas of victory and efficiency, and how, in the end, the human cost rippled far beyond the battlefield. But the story will still be here whenever you want to return to it. For now, if your eyelids are growing heavy, you might simply let them close, knowing that the soldiers of that other time would marvel at the luxury you have in this one. The simple freedom to be tired, and to answer that tiredness with sleep. And so, as you lie there in the soft dark of your own room, we can let the snow and trenches fade a little and drift instead to another kind of battlefield. Not one of mud and ice, but of polished glassware and chemical formulas, of clean benches and the faint, sharp scent of solvents. Imagine yourself now in a laboratory in late 1930s Germany. The room is long and bright, with high windows that let in a diluted northern light. Rows of glass bottles line wooden shelves, each with handwritten labels in careful script. On the benches stand beakers and flasks, Bunsen burners, metal stands holding test tubes in neat little clusters. There is a chalkboard on one wall, streaked with half-erased equations and structural diagrams. Men in white coats move quietly from bench to bench. There is the clink of glass, the soft whoosh of gas being lit, the scratch of a pen as someone records an observation in a bound notebook. In one corner, a chemist leans over a small mound of fine white crystals. To you, they look like nothing in particular, perhaps sugar or salt. But to him, they are the culmination of years of incremental work, of trial and error, of tweaking molecular structures to produce a compound that is especially potent in the human nervous system. This is methamphetamine, though that word does not yet carry the weight it will in later decades. To these men, it is simply a new stimulant, promising and interesting, a more powerful cousin of amphetamine. The company that employs them, Temler, is excited. There is a hunger in the air, not for food, but for novelty, for products that can be packaged and sold in a society obsessed with vitality and efficiency. A pill that sharpens attention, lifts mood, suppresses hunger, and delays sleep fits the spirit of the age. As you stand there in imagination, you might feel how far this place is from the front lines we have visited before. There is no gunfire here, no explosions, no shouting. The loudest sound might be a centrifuge ticking softly to a stop, or the murmur of two chemists debating an experimental result. And yet, these quiet rooms are one of the starting points of everything we have been exploring. The chemists are not, most of them, thinking about war when they work. They think of scientific elegance, of the satisfaction of understanding how a molecule interacts with a receptor, of the thrill of seeing a new compound produce a desired effect in laboratory animals or willing human test subjects. They design studies where volunteers, often medical students or junior staff, take small doses and report their sensations. The participants speak of heightened alertness, of feeling more awake, more confident, more energetic. They report being able to work longer, to study for exams late into the night without flagging. Only a few mention, in cautious notes, that sleep is harder afterward, that their hearts race, that their thoughts feel slightly ragged at the edges. These downsides are noted, but they do not yet loom large. In the balance between benefit and side effect, the scales, in the optimistic glow of the late 1930s, still tip toward benefit. Downstairs, or perhaps in another building entirely, the advertising department is at work. You can imagine a designer sitting at a drafting table, pen in hand, sketching out imagery for a leaflet. There might be a drawing of a graceful woman, tidy and elegant, managing her household with effortless energy, or a student, focused under the light of a lamp, books open in front of him. The slogans almost write themselves. Stay alert, feel refreshed, get through the day. In shop windows, posters appear showing Pervitin as a modern, scientific solution to old human problems. Fatigue, that ancient companion of work and worry, is being reframed as something that can be conquered chemically. All you need is the right pill. If you listen closely, there is an echo of this idea in our own time, in how products are marketed to you. The cup of coffee that promises a kickstart, the drink that offers energy, the supplement that claims to fight tiredness. The language is gentler now, the substances less explosive. But the underlying story is similar, that natural limits are not to be respected, but to be overcome. In that laboratory, one of the company's medical advisors writes a glowing article for a journal, praising Pervitin's usefulness in treating depression, in helping patients who struggle with low energy. He mentions that it could also be valuable in situations requiring sustained attention. Drivers on long journeys, factory workers, soldiers. Slowly, the idea seeps into the medical and military imagination. Here is a tool that can shore up human willpower at its frayed edges. Imagine now that you shift your viewpoint slightly, gliding, as if in a dream, from the laboratory to a meeting room in a military academy. The walls are decorated with portraits of stern men in uniform, captured in oils and brushstrokes. There is a long table, papers spread across it, ashtrays already full. Officers sit around the table, their tunics immaculate, their hair closely cropped. Among them is a medical officer who has been following the research on Pervitin with growing interest. He presents his findings to the others. Tests on cadets, he explains, show that those given the drug can stay awake for long periods without apparent loss of mental acuity. They complete tasks more quickly. Their drill performance remains crisp even after sleep deprivation. Reaction times are maintained. Subjectively, they report feeling more capable, more confident. The officers lean in. They are haunted, all of them, by the memory of the previous war, where exhaustion and breakdown were so common, they acquired new names: shell shock, war neurosis. They know how quickly a man's mental and physical reserves can be drained by the relentless demands of combat. Here, then, appears something intoxicating in its promise, a chemical buffer against the human tendency to falter. You, sitting far in the future and far from that polished table, can sense how exciting and how dangerous such a proposition must have seemed. The officers begin to ask practical questions. What are the side effects? How long do the benefits last? Can doses be repeated safely? In what quantities should the drug be issued to units? The medical officer answers with as much honesty as he can based on the data he has. He mentions the risk of overuse, the need for rest afterward, the possibility of nervous agitation. But against the backdrop of looming war, the value of an extra night of wakefulness, an extra 20 kilometers of marching seems to outweigh these concerns. A decision is made. Pervitin will be tested in the field. What none of them can fully anticipate is how quickly tested will become standard, how a tool meant for exceptional circumstances will slip into everyday use, how the line between help and harm will blur. You might think of the way technologies today can leap from careful trials to ubiquitous presence. How something once seen as an optional enhancement can, almost overnight, become an expected part of normal life. Back in the laboratory, the chemists continue their work. Some of them are flattered to learn that their product is being used by the armed forces. It feels like a validation of their skill, a proof that science is patriotic, that they are contributing to national strength. They may not be told, or may not ask, exactly how their drug is distributed, how often it is used, what happens to the minds and bodies that ingest it under foxhole skies rather than factory lamps. If you could sit with one of them on a lunch break, perhaps on a bench in a small garden behind the factory, you might hear him talk enthusiastically about molecules and receptors, about binding affinities and metabolic pathways. He might be kind, fond of his children, worried about his brother at the front. He may never see the reports of soldiers who break down after days without sleep, of pilots who crash not from enemy fire, but from misjudgments made in a chemically overdriven state. Human stories are rarely neat. Many of the people involved in making Pervitin were not villains in their own minds, but professionals doing the work set before them, in a culture where pushing boundaries was celebrated and where the warnings were faint compared to the loud drumbeat of more. Now, let your attention slip outward again, beyond Germany's borders. Because of course Germany was not the only country to turn to stimulants during the Second World War. Others too looked for chemical ways to keep their soldiers awake and their nerves steady. Allied pilots took benzodrine. Japanese troops had their own formulations of methamphetamine. The German case was notable for its scale and for the particular ideology it plugged into, but it was part of a broader pattern. You might imagine in another country's lab, A similar scene. Bottles, glassware, men in white coats, the same blend of curiosity and urgency. Fatigue is universal. So is fear. So is the desire of institutions to squeeze more performance out of those who serve them. What makes the German story distinctive for our purposes tonight is how deeply Pervitin became entwined with an idea of speed and modernity, with the very image of Blitzkrieg itself. Think for a moment about that word, Blitzkrieg. It conjures not only lightning in the sky, but also a sensation in the body, the rush of rapid movement, the exhilaration of forward momentum, the belief that one can outpace one's enemies simply by moving faster than they can react. Pervitin, with its capacity to override drowsiness and delay hunger, made that forward rush physiologically possible for longer than nature would otherwise permit. And so, in a way, the drug became part of the mythology of the era. Later, journalists and historians would talk about the chemically fueled Blitzkrieg, about armies on speed. The phrase chemical cheating would be used to describe the way German forces tried to hack the basic limits of human endurance. From the vantage point of someone lying comfortably in bed, listening to this story, you might wonder what it would feel like to be inside that myth, to feel your own body pulled along by it. Imagine you are no longer in lab or office, but back in the cramped interior of a staff car, rattling along a darkened road in France in 1940. Beside you sits an officer, maps spread over his knees. In his breast pocket is a small tube of tablets. He has taken them over the last 2 nights to stay sharp as he coordinates movements, talks on the radio, revises orders while the front shifts hour by hour. He is tired, though he may not fully admit it to himself. His thoughts move quickly, perhaps too quickly now, skipping from one contingency to another. He snaps at the driver over small errors, grows impatient when the radio crackles. His sense of his own indispensability is amplified. He feels that only his personal wakefulness stands between the army and disaster. Under the influence of Pervitin, his willingness to gamble may increase. Risks that would seem reckless in a rested state feel acceptable, even necessary. His self-confidence blooms, while his capacity to foresee the downstream consequences of decisions may shrink. In that car, in that one brain, a small shift is taking place. Multiply it in softer or more severe forms, by thousands of brains in thousands of vehicles, trenches, cockpits, and you begin to see another layer of what chemical cheating meant. Not just pushing bodies to march longer, but nudging minds into patterns of heightened drive and, sometimes, distorted judgment. You may have experienced on a much smaller scale how you make different choices when you are overtired, or overcaffeinated, or overstressed. Perhaps you have looked back at a late-night decision and thought, "What was I thinking?" Now imagine that same phenomenon, but magnified by a powerful stimulant and playing out not in private life, but on the stage of war. Yet, amid all this, it is crucial to remember that most of the time, life on Pervitin was not a blur of manic energy. Often, it simply felt like being able to continue doing what had to be done. The extraordinary became ordinary. A soldier on a long march might think, with a grim sort of gratitude, that at least he does not feel like collapsing. A clerk in a swaying railway carriage might be relieved that his eyes stay open while he finishes the last of his reports. A nurse in a field hospital might swallow a tablet before a night shift and feel merely that she can stand on her feet for 12 hours instead of 8. This, perhaps, is one of the most unsettling aspects of the story. How smoothly such an extreme substance could slide into the grooves of everyday necessity. It did not always look like abuse. It often looked like coping. As you lie here listening, your own coping mechanisms may come to mind. The small rituals or aids you reach for when the day has been too long or too heavy. A cup of tea, a comforting show, a warm bath, a checklist, a friend's voice. They are gentle things, mostly. They do not rewire your brain chemistry in violent ways, but they are part of how you move yourself from one state to another, how you navigate the mismatch between what life demands and what your body or mind feels ready to give. In the age of Pervitin, coping was industrialized, chemicized, folded into the machinery of a state that saw people as resources to be optimized. To bring this back, softly, to the human scale, picture again that Berlin pharmacy, now a few years into the war. The shelves are barer than before. Rationing has bitten deep. Many luxuries are gone. There are lines for basics, and some medicines are hard to come by. Behind the counter, the pharmacist is older, a little more stooped. He has lost customers, not to competition, but to the front, to the bombing, to the quiet attrition of a country at war. Pervitin, once advertised openly, is no longer displayed so prominently. Regulations have tightened, yet the pharmacist still has some stocks for those with the right papers, or those whose need feels compelling. A woman comes in with dark circles under her eyes, explaining that she works nights at a munitions factory and days caring for her children, that her husband is away, that she cannot keep going without help. Her voice trembles on the last words. The pharmacist hesitates only a moment before reaching for the familiar box. You can see him as part of the story too. Not a faceless dispenser, but a person trying to do right by those in front of him, even as the line between right and less harmful has blurred. These small transactions, a box here, a tube there, form the quiet underside of the grand narrative of war. While generals speak in sweeping terms about campaigns and strategies, while propaganda blares about heroism and sacrifice, the true cost of such ambitions is tallied in the exhaustion of ordinary people, in their strained hearts and sleepless nights. Pervitin, in a way, made that exhaustion more bearable in the moment and more profound in the long run. You might feel, as you follow this thread, a gentle pull toward gratitude for your own life's more modest pace. Perhaps it does not always feel modest. Perhaps your days sometimes feel overwhelming, your tasks many. But compared to the churning demands of total war, there is likely more room in your life for rest, for boundaries, for saying enough without fear of catastrophe. And that is one of the quiet gifts of looking back at such history in a slow, soothing way. It can make your own tiredness feel less like a failing and more like a wise, natural guide. In the chapters yet to come, we can wander into post-war research institutes, where scientists sifted through veterans' experiences to understand, in clinical terms, what prolonged stimulant use had done. We can eavesdrop on the early conversations about addiction and dependence, on the gradual shift from seeing Pervitin as a marvel to recognizing it as a warning. We can also step sideways into stories of other wars and other stimulants, seeing how the pattern recurs. The temptation to solve human limits with chemistry, the inevitable discovery that those limits are there for a reason. But for now, let your breath slow a little. You are not in a lab or a staff car or a pharmacy. You are in your own room, in your own time. Your heart may be beating a touch more slowly than when we began, soothed by the quiet cadence of the tale. If your eyes are growing heavy, you might allow them to close for a moment and imagine all those small white tablets dissolving into dust, their sharp edges softened by the passing years, their once intense effects now just stories, just lessons carried forward. The people who swallowed them are mostly gone now. Their bodies have long since rested. Your body, here and now, asks only for the kindness of sleep, a simple, natural medicine that costs nothing and cheats no one. When you are ready, we can continue to wander through the shadowed corridors of this history, always gently, always at a pace that lets you drift away whenever sleep comes, without any need for pills, or orders, or lightning wars racing across the map. When you feel ready to walk a little further into this story, you can imagine opening your eyes again inside another quiet room. This one is not in wartime Germany, but in a calmer, later decade. The war has been over for years. Cities have been rebuilt, at least on the surface. Children play in streets that were once rubble. New shop fronts gleam where old ones burned. People are busy with the ordinary miracles of peace. Marriages, jobs, washing hung to dry in small courtyards, radios playing music instead of air raid warnings. But in a hospital building of pale stone, with polished corridors and the faint smell of disinfectant. A small group of doctors and researchers are still living partly in the shadows of the past. Picture a consultation room. A desk, 2 chairs, a small window that looks out onto a line of chestnut trees. On the wall, a framed anatomical chart shows the human nervous system in fine-colored lines, branching and looping like a map. In one chair sits a middle-aged man in a plain suit. His hair is thinning, his hands are working restlessly at the brim of his hat, turning it over and over. Opposite him sits a doctor, a notepad on his knee, a pen poised. The man in the suit is a veteran. He has come because his sleep is broken, his heart races, his thoughts sometimes spin uncontrollably. He says he feels tired all the time and yet cannot rest. He has trouble holding down jobs. He grows irritable with his children. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, memories from the front crash over him so vividly that he is sure he can smell the cold earth of the trench again. The doctor listens, asks gentle questions. As the story unfolds, one detail recurs: the little white tablets. The veteran speaks of them without much drama. "They gave them to us," he says, as if stating a simple fact about the weather. "We took them when we had to march or stay awake. At first, only when ordered. Later, well, we had them. We used them." The doctor nods, makes a note. He has heard this before. In the years since the war, he and his colleagues have been collecting such stories, trying to piece together a picture of what prolonged stimulant use does to a human being. Not just in the hours and days after a dose, but in the months and years that follow. His notebook holds many variations on the same theme: difficulty sleeping, racing heart, bouts of agitation, periods of low mood, an elusive sense that one's inner balance has been disturbed. You might imagine flipping through his notes, pages and pages of cramped handwriting, seeing how often the word Pervitin appears, tucked among other terms: trauma, exhaustion, anxiety. These doctors are, in a way, among the first to look back at the war, not just in terms of battles and borders, but in terms of chemistry and nerves. They are trying to translate lived experience into clinical language, to turn scattered anecdotes into something like understanding. As you watch them work, you might feel a quiet sympathy for their task. How do you disentangle the effects of a drug from the effects of war itself? Everyone who sat in that chair with the hat turning in his hands has seen things most of us never see. Death up close, fear, hunger, cold, the sudden loss of friends. Any of those alone can leave deep marks on the mind. Add into that mixture years of fluctuating sleep, bodily stress, and the repeated jolts of a powerful stimulant, and it becomes very difficult to say, this symptom comes from this cause, and that symptom comes from that. The doctors do their best. They read new research from other countries, where scientists are also beginning to describe amphetamine psychosis, dependence, withdrawal. They compare notes. They discuss case histories in low voices over coffee, in the hospital canteen. They are, perhaps, a little haunted. Because when they reconstruct what was done, the doses given, the instructions written, the campaigns planned with chemistry as a quiet partner, they realize that an entire generation of young men had their basic rhythms tampered with in a way no previous generation had. Sleep, that most ancient of healers, was pushed aside again and again, first by orders and then by pills. You might picture one of these doctors walking home at the end of the day, his briefcase heavy with papers. He passes through streets that are busy with the evening rush. Bicycles, trams, shoppers. Neon signs flicker to life. He sees in the faces around him traces of the same restless energy he has begun to recognize in his patients. The tight jaw, the quick step, the way some people's eyes seem always on the verge of darting to a new distraction. He wonders how many of them, too, swallowed Pervitin once, twice, 100 times. He wonders how many of their current problems, the ulcers, the insomnia, the mysterious palpitations, can be traced back to those nights when the human need for rest was overridden by a tablet in the palm. And he knows that for many of the decision makers of that era, those nights were counted as success. The bridge was taken. The advance continued. The battle was won. It is only later that the bill arrived. In your own life, you might have felt something similar on a smaller scale. Those times when you pushed yourself past tiredness, past hunger, past your own quiet limits, in order to meet a deadline or fulfill a duty, and then paid for it later with a crash, or an illness, or a sudden wave of sadness. What happened in wartime Germany with Pervitin was that pattern magnified and formalized, turned into policy. Now, sitting comfortably and safely, you can follow its threads into other corners of the post-war world. One thread leads into the realm of law. As stories of misuse and dependence accumulate, legislators begin to reconsider how such stimulants should be classified. Substances that once sat lightly on pharmacy shelves, advertised with smiling faces, now start to move into stricter categories: controlled, prescription only, recognized as dangerous when used freely. For Pervitin and its chemical cousins, this means that the world in which you could walk into a shop and buy them like cough drops fades away. The words used about them shift, from pep pills and pick-me-ups to narcotics, abuse, addiction. But laws, like regulations in wartime, are one thing on paper and another in practice. In backrooms, on street corners, in certain clubs and bars, stimulants continue to circulate, rebranded, repackaged, sometimes made illegally. What began in a respectable factory lab as a cutting-edge medicine becomes, in the hands of underground chemists, part of an illicit trade. You can feel here another echo of chemical cheating, this time not in the context of armies, but of individuals seeking unfair advantage or escape. Students staying awake for exams, drivers covering impossible distances, workers pushing through night shifts, party-goers chasing euphoria. Some of them reach for amphetamines. Some later will reach for entirely different substances. The pattern is familiar. Fatigue or pain or sadness is met with a chemical that, for a while, makes it all easier to bear. Then the bill comes due. Another thread leads into sports. In the decades after the war, as professional athletics becomes more commercialized and the stakes rise, some athletes and their trainers begin to experiment with stimulants in competition. A tablet that sharpens focus, dulls the sensation of fatigue, and allows a runner to hold a pace just a little longer is tempting. The line between training hard and doping becomes another of those murky boundaries. It is not quite the same as Pervitin at the front, of course, but the underlying philosophy, that chemistry can be used to squeeze more performance out of a human being than nature easily allows, is strikingly similar. And just as wartime stimulants led, slowly, to debates about fairness and harm, so too does doping in sports lead to arguments about what it means to cheat, about where the line lies between a normal cup of coffee before a race and a banned substance in a syringe. You might lie there, listening to all this, and feel a gentle tug of concern. Are we, as a species, always doomed to fall for the same trick? To see a limit, and instead of asking, why is this limit here, to ask, how can I get around it? But it's important not to see only the repetition. There is also learning. The lessons of wartime Pervitin use did not disappear into silence. They informed later policies, later warnings. Researchers studying addiction in the 1950s and 1960s did so with an awareness that millions had already lived through a large-scale, if unintentional, experiment with amphetamines under the most stressful conditions imaginable. In their cautious language, their data tables and graphs, you can sense a kind of respect for the human nervous system's vulnerability. Perhaps, sitting here in your own time, you have seen public health campaigns about drugs, or news stories about the dangers of methamphetamine, or documentaries about its devastating effects in certain communities. Those warnings are part of the long shadow cast by substances like Pervitin. And behind those warnings are the ghostly outlines of soldiers on night marches, pilots gripping their controls with white knuckles, young mothers sewing under bare bulbs, clerks shuffling papers in offices, all with the same bitter taste on their tongues. As we move further along this story, it may be helpful to pause and look at one particular moment when the costs and benefits of chemical cheating in war came into sharp focus. Picture a staff meeting in the later years of the conflict, perhaps 1943 or 1944. The early victories are long past. The war has turned. German forces are on the defensive on multiple fronts. The mood in military headquarters is harder, more strained. The confident energy of 1940 has been replaced by a more brittle determination, shot through with anxiety. At a long table sit senior officers and medical officials. In front of them are reports, casualty figures, supply shortages, and among them a thick bundle of papers describing psychological disturbances among troops who have been repeatedly dosed with stimulants over long periods. The language is clinical. Hallucinatory episodes, extreme agitation, loss of contact with reality. There are also more subtle observations. Chronic irritability, flattened affect, difficulty reintegrating into unit life after rest periods. A debate unfolds. Some argue that in the current desperate situation, any tool that can help maintain frontline performance must be used, side effects or not. They point to units that have held out under extraordinary pressure, attributing some of their endurance to chemical support. Others, especially those who have been at the front and seen the aftermath of such support, warn that the long-term degradation of soldiers' mental health will, in the end, harm combat effectiveness far more than a few extra hours of wakefulness can help it. Behind their arguments lies a deeper difference in how they see the men under their command. To some, soldiers are primarily instruments, resources to be used and replaced, cogs in a machine that must keep grinding. To others, they are, even in war, human beings whose minds and bodies carry moral weight. You might imagine sitting invisibly at that table, listening as voices rise and fall. The ash in the trays grows longer. Outside, air raid sirens may wail and then fade. Inside, decisions are made that will ripple out into the lives of thousands. In those conversations, the first faint outlines of what we now call ethics of enhancement begin to appear. Is it right to alter a person's mind and body in order to make them fight longer, harder, with less sleep? Does the urgency of war justify anything? At what point does supporting performance tip into a form of internal warfare, turning soldiers' own nervous systems into battlegrounds? These questions would not be resolved in that room, but they would echo, years later, in discussions about everything from military experiments with other psychoactive drugs to the use of stimulants by surgeons, pilots, and even emergency responders in our own era. You live in a time when those debates continue, often quietly, tucked away in policy papers and ethics committees. You may never see them, but they influence protocols, regulations, unwritten norms. The story of Pervitin in the Second World War is one of the early chapters in that ongoing conversation. Lying there, perhaps with your mind beginning to soften at the edges, you might choose, just for a moment, to step back from the specifics, the names, the dates, the pills. Instead, you can let this whole history settle into a simple human contrast. On one side, the belief that value lies in doing more, marching farther, working later, pushing past tiredness, ignoring the soft voice that says, stop. On the other side, a quieter wisdom that says humans are not machines, that rest is not a weakness but a requirement, that sometimes the bravest thing one can do is to honor a limit. War, by its very nature, leans heavily toward the first side. It rewards those who can push through, who can override fatigue, who can continue operating in conditions that would normally force a halt. Pervitin was a chemical tool that made that overriding easier. It offered the illusion that there would be no consequences. But the consequences were simply delayed, pushed into the future, into veterans' hospitals and family kitchens and sleepless bedrooms. You, lying here tonight, are not under such pressures. You do not need to fight a war against your own tiredness. There will be more to explore. More small, human stories of how people navigated life during and after this strange era of state-sanctioned stimulation. More reflections on how it shaped our modern understanding of drugs, performance, and the ethics of pushing beyond our natural limits. For now, though, you might let the details blur slightly, like ink in water. See in your mind's eye the little white tablets dissolving, the cardboard tubes empty, the fields and trenches slowly reclaimed by grass and snow. Picture the laboratory glassware cleaned and put away, the benches silent, the formulas on the chalkboard wiped off by a careful hand. What remains, when those tangible things are gone, is a kind of lesson. That lesson does not arrive in the form of a scolding, but as a gentle reminder, whispered by history, that our bodies often know better than our ambitions, and that listening to their signals is an act of wisdom. As your own body signals that it is time to rest, with heavy limbs, softening thoughts, perhaps a yawn, you have the rare privilege of being able to obey. No one will tell you to stay awake. No one will press a pill into your palm. There are no bridges to seize before dawn, no maps to be redrawn by your effort tonight. There is only the quiet room, the soft bedding, the steady rhythm of your breathing, and the slow, unfolding story of people long gone, whose struggles can help you cherish the simple, ordinary grace of closing your eyes and letting sleep come when it wishes. If you're still with me, dear listener, let's take another slow, quiet step together into this shadowed history. Imagine the room around you fading, softening, and when it comes back into focus, you are somewhere else entirely. You find yourself in a dimly lit archive reading room. It is decades after the war. Outside the tall windows, the world is calm. Bicycles pass, a tram bell rings, leaves move in a faint breeze. Inside, the air smells of old paper and dust and a hint of floor polish. Lamps pool warm light onto long wooden tables. Cardboard boxes sit stacked in neat rows, each labelled with tidy handwriting. Unit reports, medical files, correspondence. You are not alone here. A historian sits a few seats away, hunched over a folder. Her hair is tied back, her glasses perched low on her nose. She turns pages carefully, her fingers tracing underlined phrases, her pen occasionally adding a note in the margin of her notebook. On the page before her is a report from a wartime medical officer. It is written in precise formal German, the script slightly cramped, as if trying to fit too much into too little space. The first part describes what we might expect: numbers of wounded, types of injuries, cases of frostbite, outbreaks of dysentery. Then, toward the end, there is a paragraph about something less visible. He describes states of agitation following prolonged administration of Pervitin, cases where soldiers experience hallucinations, suspicion toward comrades, and difficulty distinguishing reality from imagined threats. He mentions that some of these men were previously stable, that their deterioration seemed linked to periods of intense stimulant use combined with extreme sleep deprivation. The historian pauses here. She taps her pen lightly against the table, thinking. In her research, she has seen those words before: agitation, hallucinations, suspicion. They appear in reports from different fronts, different units, scattered at first, like lone islands. But when she begins to connect them, a pattern emerges. You might imagine her spreading several such pages out in front of her, like tiles in a mosaic. Here is a case from the Eastern Front, a sentry who became convinced that his own unit was the enemy, who fired wildly into the night and had to be restrained. Here is one from North Africa, a driver who, after days of driving convoys through the desert, dosed regularly with Pervitin, began to see phantom vehicles on the road, swerving to avoid them and nearly causing a wreck. Here is one from an airfield in France, a mechanic who took the drug not for combat, but to get through long shifts repairing aircraft, and who later reported being plagued by racing thoughts and insomnia that lasted for months after his supply ran out. Each story is small on its own, but together they tell a deeper truth, that chemistry does not merely touch the edges of experience, but sometimes rearranges its center. From where you lie, you can watch this historian gently reconstruct such truths, one file at a time. She is patient. She takes breaks, stretching, sipping from a mug of coffee gone lukewarm. It has taken her years to gather these fragments, to read between the lines of documents written in the formal, restrained language of military bureaucracy, and gradually she shapes them into something more human, a book perhaps, or an article, that tells the story of how a wartime state, in love with speed and efficiency, turned to a pill to make its soldiers into something closer to machines. And what happened when those soldiers turned out, stubbornly, to be human after all. It's worth remembering, though, that this story is not just German. Let your imagination drift for a moment across the channel to a different night, a different airfield. It is England in the early 1940s. The air is damp and cold. The runway glistens faintly under sparse lighting. A British bomber squadron is preparing for a long mission over occupied Europe. Ground crew move like shadows around heavy aircraft, checking engines, loading bombs, securing hatches. Inside a low brick building nearby, a group of aircrew sit at wooden tables, mugs of tea in front of them, flight jackets draped over chairbacks. The room smells of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and a hint of nervous sweat. On the wall, a large map is dotted with pins and lines of coloured string showing routes. A medical officer stands at the front, delivering a brief talk, his voice calm but firm. He mentions fatigue, vigilance, the need for alertness on long night sorties. Then he opens a small metal tin and begins to move along the rows, placing something on the tables in front of the men. Tablets of benzodrine, an amphetamine used by the Allies. He gives instructions quite similar to those given in German briefings. Take them if you feel your concentration slipping. Do not overuse them. Report any side effects. In this, you can see that the urge to cheat tiredness chemically was not confined to any one nation. Under the pressure of total war, the same solutions emerged in different uniforms and different languages. From an Allied pilot's perspective, the experience would have felt strangely akin to that of his German counterpart. Sitting in the cockpit, engine roaring, blackness stretching out beyond the nose of the plane, he might feel his eyelids drooping as the hours pass. The monotony of the mission, the long, steady flight to the target, the tense minutes over the objective, the long, steady flight back, presses on his mind. He takes a tablet. After a while, he feels more awake, more focused. Instruments seem easier to read. His reactions feel crisp. He may be grateful for this, acutely aware that a moment's distraction could mean death for himself and his crew. Later, like his German counterpart, he may find sleep elusive, his heart racing even as his bunk beckons. He may lie awake replaying the mission, each flak burst vivid, each searchlight sweep impressed on his mind. When we talk about chemical cheating in warfare, then, we are not pointing a finger at one side alone, but at a broader human temptation, the belief that, in moments of crisis, we can borrow from tomorrow's strength to achieve today's goals, and that the bill will somehow be manageable when it arrives. You might recognize that feeling in your own life, on a much smaller scale, staying up too late, borrowing energy from the next morning to finish one more task, answer one more message, watch one more episode. Sometimes, of course, that borrowing is harmless. The world does not end if you are a bit tired the next day, but if it becomes a pattern, if you constantly live on borrowed energy, you may begin to feel the quiet erosion it brings. Now picture yourself back on the floor of that archive, where the historian is closing her file, stretching her stiff shoulders. She has spent much of the afternoon tracing not just the acute effects of wartime stimulants, but their lingering presence in memories and testimonies. Some veterans, when interviewed in old age, barely mention the pills. except as a passing detail in a larger tapestry of hardship. Others bring them up with startling intensity, as if the little tablets were a key that unlocked a whole period of their lives. One man, perhaps, describes how he felt invincible on Pervitin, how he could march for hours without feeling pain, how he grew reckless in battle, volunteering for dangerous tasks. He might confess, in a quieter voice, that he later felt ashamed of the things he did in that heightened state, unsure whether they reflected his true character or a chemical distortion of it. Another tells of how, in the years after the war, he would occasionally dream of the tablets themselves, small white discs tumbling across a wooden table, always just out of reach, always associated with a strange blend of dread and longing. Such testimonies remind us that drugs are not just pharmacology, they are symbolism, memory, emotion. For some, Pervitin became wrapped up with the idea of survival, of having made it through impossible situations. For others, it became a symbol of being used, of having their bodies pushed beyond what they should have been asked to bear. As you lie there listening, you might think of substances in your own culture that carry similar symbolic weight. Coffee as the emblem of the busy worker, wine of relaxation, certain medications of control or freedom or shame. Our relationship to chemicals is always, in part, a story we tell ourselves. In wartime, the story told to soldiers was straightforward. This pill will help you do your duty. It was presented as a tool, almost like a weapon or a piece of equipment. The more subtle story, the one about costs and dependence and what it means to outsource resilience to chemistry, could only be written later in quieter rooms with the benefit of hindsight. Now bring your attention back to the present moment, to yourself in your bed. Your heart is beating steadily. You're breathing perhaps a little slower than when we began. You are not under bombardment or subject to orders. You can listen or drift away at will. In this peaceful state, it may be easier to feel another, softer thread woven through this history, that of resilience, not chemically enhanced, but quietly enduring. Because, for all the focus on Pervitin, it's important to remember that countless soldiers, nurses, civilians, and others made it through those years on little more than will, companionship, and such rest as they could steal. They drank coffee when they could, smoked cigarettes, told jokes, leaned on one another. They collapsed into sleep whenever the chance arose, even if it was only a few minutes in a corner, a brief doze on a crate, or leaning against a wall. Their bodies, though strained, were still allowed at least some cycles of rest and repair. We often focus on the extraordinary, the pill, the injection, the experimental technique, and overlook the quiet power of these ordinary human resources. Perhaps, as you hear about the extremes of chemical stimulation, you can allow yourself to feel a kind of appreciation for the simple tools you have for getting through your own hard days. The friend you can text, the walk you can take outside, the moment of putting down your phone and letting your eyes rest on something green, the small pleasure of a favorite song. They are modest, but they are honest. They do not pretend to suspend the laws of your body. They work within them. One of the dangers of Pervitin in wartime was that it whispered a different message, that human limits were outdated, that with the right pill you could be sharper, braver, more tireless than your ancestors could ever imagine. History, looking back, answers that whisper with a firm, quiet no. There is a limit to how long a human heart can pound, how many nights a brain can be denied deep sleep without fraying. The men who swallowed those tablets could not in the end become machines. Many of them simply became very tired, very hurt humans. You might notice your own body, in contrast, sinking gradually toward rest as we walk this long, looping path through their story. If your thoughts are beginning to meander, if the narrative starts to blur at the edges like a dream, that is all right. You do not need to grasp every detail. This is not an exam, not a briefing. It is a gentle companion to your drifting mind. The soldiers we have followed did not have such company in their sleepless hours. Their minds raced alone, lit up by chemistry and fear. You are allowed company as you fall asleep. As we continue in later chapters, we can wander still further into the ethics discussions that arose in later wars when militaries considered new drugs, into the cultural memory of the war on speed in post-war Europe, into the ways this history has been retold in films and books, sometimes with more drama than nuance. For now, though, rest in the simple human contrast at the heart of all of this. There is a kind of power in refusing to turn against your own body, in choosing not to fight your tiredness as if it were an enemy. There is a quiet courage in saying, "This is enough for today," even when a part of you nags that you could do more, stay up later, push a little harder. The men who took Pervitin often never had the chance to practice that courage. Their circumstances stripped them of that option. Their refusal would have been called disobedience, cowardice, failure. You have the enormous luxury of being able to simply stop, to close your eyes, to let your breathing carry you, slowly, out and in, like waves on a very gentle shore. Far away from the sharp metallic brightness of methamphetamine-fueled wakefulness. If sleep is coming for you now, you can let it. And if you are still awake, still curious, we can keep walking in the next part, moving gently into the later ripples of this story. Always remembering that unlike the people we are talking about, you can step away at any moment, lay the story aside, and drift into the soft, honest rest that no tablet can truly replace.